What is up, and welcome back to the Fortman Podcast, where we are going to be continuing our study through the book of Romans. Today we're going to tackle Romans 4 and this idea of Abraham is justified by his faith. And, we've kind of prefaced each episode with, we're not theological scholars, and we're not going to get to every verse by verse, but we're going to try to really just talk to what stuck out to us and maybe what we understand, maybe what confuses us, and just kind of ask each other questions and really just do like a typical Bible study of, what stuck out to us, what we felt like God was trying to speak to us, and maybe some different questions that we have. So today I'm honored that Ben Stuart is joining us today virtually from DC, and he's going to try to help us from a more theological standpoint on maybe some things that might go over our heads. So Ben, is there any way, just before we kind of dive into Romans 4, if you could just maybe, that idea of Abraham justified by faith, if you could kind of just help provide some context for where we're at right now in the book and where we're going to be going.
Yeah, man, totally. And hey, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I'd say where are we? Romans chapter 4 is basically an illustration of what y'all have already been talking about. If you think Paul's been building his argument of how is one right with God, and he gets to that big statement at the end of Romans 3, where, hey, we are justified. That means made right with God by faith, believing in what God has done on our behalf, not on what we're able to pull off, because nobody's righteous. And he made that point. The Gentiles, people who grew up without knowing the Bible, they weren't right. Their conscience condemns them. And then he's pressing in on his Jewish people, saying, hey, we had the law and we didn't follow it. So the law is not going to make us right before God. So Jew and Gentile both need God to come get us. We're not going to ascend to him. We are justified, made right by faith in God, not by work. And so then he has this whole argument in 27 and following of chapter 3 of so there's no boasting. God's the God of both, Jew and Gentile. Both needed him to come rescue them. And then that's his thesis of the whole book. And so he just lays that thesis out, and you're like, okay, well then, do I really believe that? Is that true? And so to illustrate his point, if you're trying to win over a Jewish person in this argument, you go to the OJ, man, the original Jew, and say, all right, what happened to Abraham? Let's talk about him. And so that's where we start here, is he's laying out the question. I just told you we're made right by faith, not by work. Let's go to the father of all Jews, Abraham, and say, how was he made right with God? Let's look at his life. And that's the argument up top, is how we got there. And I won't explain it all yet, so we can talk about it. But that's his first part. How is he made right? And that's the big question for all of us, right? How do you have peace with God? Is it, I grew up in church, I grew up with a religious background, or is it something else? And we're going to see with the father of the faith, it was something else. And so that's where we are. This is an illustration of the point he's been making.
Yeah, he starts in verse 4, and verse 2 says, for if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. And it says, for what does the scripture say? And then Paul here is quoting Genesis 15:6. He says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And we're going to get into it a little bit more about, circumcision and that idea of it was counted to him as righteousness. And this commentary that I was reading says that happened, that it was counted him as righteousness 14 years before he was circumcised. Kind of in the illustration of, because Abraham is the father to the Jews and the Gentiles, signifying before the covenant. Yeah, I do think it's cool that Paul is addressing to the Jewish people, and yeah, he does go back to Abraham to provide context for kind of where he's going through. Yeah, that's cool. That was a perfect synopsis, and one that none of us would have been able to give. So thank you so much for that. What is that phrase, like something to boast about, and then counted him as righteousness? What does that really mean?
Yeah, I was thinking, well, just first off, a lot of syllables in a lot of these words. So I'm going to try to simplify a little bit in my own mind. Talking about flesh, or talking about being justified by works versus justified by righteousness or belief in God. I've always struggled with this thought because I understand it's not about the works. Like, it's not about, God's not saying you have to follow all these rules and then you get in. And if you don't follow the rules, you get out. God's saying, or Jesus is saying, I died on the cross for you. I did all the things perfect and was a sacrifice so that you can be saved. You're in. But we might get into this, so this might be a tangent. I've been confused on this point of like, okay, but you still have to like believe. Is belief a work? Is belief not a work? Like where does that fall on the works, not works?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was like the next place I was going to want to go. Yeah, Ben, what's the like justified by works? Because we just went through James, where James is super works heavy from the standpoint of because he's addressing people who claim they have faith, but then there was no action, there's no deed behind it. And here Paul's kind of addressing people who have works, but there's really no faith behind it. So how do you, like, when it says justified by works, what's the difference between like justified by works versus works being like a response to what you say you believe?
Yeah, it's interesting because both Paul and James go to Abraham, right? Because if you're Jewish and want to establish your theological argument, you go back to the original Jew. You go back to Abraham and say, what worked for him? And what Paul does here is interesting, because he's trying to lay out to them, like if you were to ask maybe a person at that time, a Jewish person, how do you be okay with God? They would have said, well, we got circumcision, which is a sign that we're in this covenant with God. And then we obey the stipulations and rules of that covenant that was given to Moses. Basically, do these things and I'll bless you. Do these things and you're in trouble. That was the covenant God gave to Moses. And so he goes back before Moses to Abraham and said, how was Abraham right with God? And Paul will go to Genesis 15, where God told Abraham, I'm sending you a seed, an heir, and the whole world's going to be blessed through him. And you're going to have children like a multitude, like sand on the seashore. And he was like, I believe you. I believe you're blessing the world through a seed that's going to come from me. And that belief in God made him right. You're right with me. Now, was he perfect at that point? No, he was a mess. But he just I believe God is doing something that's going to rescue us. And Paul goes, hey, back then, he wasn't circumcised. And God declared him right before God. Guess what? He hadn't entered the covenant yet. That comes in Genesis 15, right? So being right before God was not dependent on his circumcision, because that was an uncircumcised dude that God just called right. And so that's the argument Paul will make. But then James will grab Genesis 22 later, where you see God's been working on Abraham's faith. Abraham never wavered, is what it says in this passage. He always believed God would work, but he was always making mistakes. Remember, like, gave the missus away to Egypt. Yeah, he was doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So he was imperfect. He struggled. But at the end, when he was willing to give God everything, including his son, God says, now I know your actions are verifying that you really are a man of faith. And James will go to that one. So faith alone saves, but the faith that saves is never alone. It's accompanied by works. But that's what's so important, is where do you put work? If you say faith plus works equals salvation, that's heresy according to the Bible. But if you say faith equals salvation plus work, yeah, that's the gospel. We're going to see faith express itself through your actions. But what you brought up is a good point about, is faith a work? Some people argue with that. God saves by miracle. And Paul seems to be making the point here that faith is not a work, because he's saying either work or you trust that God's working. And so he doesn't talk about faith as if it's this thing you have to do. He talks about faith as a resting in what God has done.
Lou, do you have something?
When Ben brought up Genesis 22, because I was going back and forth between chapter 15 and 22, and I was thinking about, because as Ben was saying, Abraham's faith was continuing to grow, and but it was a moment. There was a point that Abraham said to Isaac, and I thought this was huge, and this is also foreshadowing God sending Jesus later. But I'm going to read this real quick. It says, when Abraham said to the young man, "Stay here with the donkey, I and the boy will go over and worship and come again to you." Abraham took the wood and the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. He took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they both went together. Skip down, and this was incredible to me. It says, and Isaac said to his father, because you think about, they're hiking up this mountain, so this, there's conversation being had, and this question that Isaac says, he says, verse 7, "Yep, behold, in the fire and the wood, where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Isaac asked. And Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." And I feel like in that moment, you think about Abraham climbing the mountain with his son, and I was thinking about just for myself doing the same thing. And like, you have to have, he's a human, he was having to have some doubt doing this, like, man, is God actually going to provide? But he had that faith that Matthew tells us of a mustard seed, that he was going to trust that God was going to provide. And I think the biggest thing, and I think this is what God wants us to have whenever he asks of us to do something, is to the point where we draw the knife to kill his son. In that moment, that's when God provided that ram. And so I think when we look at that pivotal moment of Abraham's life, and I think that's what Ben was saying, that God's seen that, man, Abraham is willing to do whatever, even to give up his own son, just like I'm going to do for my people. And we know, obviously, that's what God did for us with Jesus. So that was, I don't know, to me, man, that's a huge thing that I think for Abraham and his faith. And we go back to Romans. That was a good tie-in for me.
Something I kind of wrestle with, and whoever can kind of speak to it, but I kind of just feel like this thought of, and I could be completely wrong on this, but I just feel like faith 2,000 years ago, I feel like it holds more weight than maybe sometimes what we claim faith is today, if that makes sense. Like, because I mean, in Romans, Paul speaking to people who, if you believe something, if you have faith for this, then there's a chance that you're going to be killed for it. Now, just with, the easy access we have in the West to the Bible and to, into certain things, I feel like sometimes maybe a belief in something can kind of just be diluted with like just the access that you have to it, and kind of lose like the reverence to it. So I don't know if there's any truth to that, but I just feel like with Abraham believing God and his faith, and Paul talking about faith, and just that time period of, if you say you believe this, if you really have faith for this, then it will change everything about you, because why are you going to say you're going to believe something if you don't truly believe it, because there's a chance that you're going to be killed for it. And I feel like sometimes now, I feel like sometimes we say we believe it, but then it's like there's no action behind it, and it's like, well, I feel like it would have been different 2,000 years ago if you say you believed it, because kind of more was at stake for saying that you believed in Jesus and who he was. So I don't know. Do you feel like there's a difference in like claiming faith then versus now, just because of cultural context of kind of where we are?
Well, my initial thought here is all the original non-Jews reading this, when they said it's not by circumcision but by faith, everyone just let out a big sigh of relief, like, whew, okay, good. And when he starts going to circumcision, I'm sure everyone back then was getting a little nervous.
Yeah, I just think that's interesting that he was circumcised 14 years after God, after his faith was counted to him as righteousness. Kind of like what you said, Ben. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, on like the faith then versus faith now, if it's kind of where we're at in a society?
Yeah, it's interesting, man, because you go to, again, he's using Abraham as an example. When God goes to Abraham to grab him, I mean, Joshua tells us Abraham was worshiping idols like everybody else. So this is the thing that, all of us do this. We tend to go like, oh, well, here's this huge religious standard, and we got to try to ascend to that. And then that person can boast before God. They got their act together. Their discipline got them there. Paul's argument here was, no. Go back to, who was Abraham? He was a mess, and God grabbed him. So God is so loving, he will condescend to call righteous an Abraham who was shaky at the beginning. And then he name drops David, and everybody knew David was a mess. So it's like, but David was blessed. Why? Because his sins got forgiven. And we know what his sins were, and they were not good.
Taking care of your health is not always easy, but it should at least be simple. And that's why for the last 3 years, I've been drinking AG1 every day. It's just one scoop mixed in water once a day, every day. And it makes me feel more nourished, strong, and like I'm ready to take on the day. And I recommend AG1 to all my friends and family. You've heard me talk about my dad in the past, but my cousin loves to drink it as well. She lives out in California, and there's plenty of healthy habits out there, but she loves to drink AG1 in the mornings to start her day. My wife, Sadie, loves to drink it, and you've heard me mention John David from the Dot Call Room before on the podcast, and I've gotten him to drink it as well. When I drink AG1, I know that I'm covering my nutritional bases right at the start of my day. I'm getting support from my brain, gut, and immune health since AG1 is packed with vitamins, probiotics, and nutrients. In a research study, AG1 was shown to double the amount of healthy bacteria in your gut as well. I love that every scoop includes vitamin C and zinc to support my immune health. And so many people have asked me if AG1 is actually the real deal, and trust me, there's a reason why I've been drinking it for so long. And the best part of all, I don't have to worry about mixing and matching pills and powders because AG1 is an all-in-one solution that supports my mental and physical health without all the hassle. In just 60 seconds, I'm giving my body everything it needs and setting up a sustainable, healthy habit. If there's one product I trust to support my whole body health, it's AG1. And that's why we have been partnered with them for so long. It's easy and satisfying to start your journey with AG1. So try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 plus K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase at drinkag1.com/Huff. That's drinkag1.com/Huff. Check it out.
There's this challenge here to all of us of like, how are you right with God? It is not by what you do. It's not by what you do. And sometimes that's so hard for us to accept. We want to kind of add something to it. But it's lovely when you go, yeah, the entrance fee is the acknowledgement that I'm guilty, and we all are, and I can't fix me. So I think there's all kinds of people coming alive in Jesus by faith, that you look at their life. And Abraham, right after Genesis 12, he lets Pharaoh take his wife because he says, if I don't, they'll kill me. I mean, he pimps out the missus as a man of faith. You're like, that is wildly inappropriate activity. And yet God is working on him. So you're like, okay. So you can look at somebody and go, you are so far from what you're supposed to be doing, and they still be alive in God, right? So God can condescend to that person and keep working on them. But then on the flip side, you can have some people that, like the Jewish people he's challenging in this text, all the laws, but you think your knowledge or your activity is going to make you right before God? No. I don't think you understand how deep this thing goes. So I know I'm like taking a long way to get to your question, Christian. Sorry, but it's very hard in a moment to tell where somebody's at, and so you just kind of got to watch them over time. And I think that's what you see in this back paragraph moving towards the end is you see, okay, when Abraham got in, he was shaky. But what happened? He kept believing God is who he says he is. God's going to do what he says he does. And so he had a real faith, but he grew strong in his faith. So you go, okay, both of those things are true. It's not like, well, you don't have real faith because we're not seeing it in action. No, he had a real faith. It was just weak. It was its first day in the gym. It didn't know what it was doing. It was doing all the machines wrong. It was lifting the weights wrong, bad form. So, but it was a real faith. And then God kept making it stronger and stronger. And that's the hope for us. If you're listening to this and you're like, man, I just feel like I don't want to darken the door of a church because of what I did on Friday. You're like, hey, David did some pretty messed up stuff on Friday, but God blesses those who trust him to forgive. And then God goes to work on you, and he starts to make you work that muscle of faith and grow that muscle of faith. But I think you're right, Christian. If you look up at somebody in 5 years, 10 years, and you see no fruit, then you got to wonder if the root's there, right? Because the difference is God keeps working with Abraham. God works with this kid.
Yeah, that's good.
It was just credited to him as righteousness when he believed what God had told him, and then the dream, and then I feel like out of impatience, this situation with Hagar happens, and I feel like that was a moment where we see what you're talking about, like with Abraham. The impatience led him to try to make a means out of his own ability, and even in that, like, God addresses it with Abraham, like, no, like, this was not the plan, and tells Hagar too, like, I will greatly multiply your offspring, which is another act of grace, right, with her too. And so, like, I just love that picture, and the thought too that I love to think about is how the time period plays out from the moment that God promised Abraham the seed and the land, and was 23 years to when Isaac comes. And so then, I don't know how long into that the situation with Hagar, maybe, that's just interesting. 23 years believing that.
Yeah, especially on this back half where it talks about, like in verse 18, and hope against hope. And hope he believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told, so shall your offspring be. Even though his body was as good as dead. His name was Abraham, right? Or Abram. And God told him, I'm changing your name to Abraham. So from exalted father to father of many nations. And he still didn't have a kid. But God was like, I want you to look in the mirror and call yourself, I'm the father of many nations. I want you, when caravans go by and they ask what your name is, you're like, my name's father of many nations. How many kids do you have? 0. But it's cool because God said I would be the father of many nations. Like, at some point, do you start to sound crazy? But God makes them, I want you to own this identity because I said so. And I can call things that are not as though they are. I said you're going to be a father. Believe that. And then I'm going to make you one. And the father of many nations. And it worked. And I think that's the fight of faith for a lot of us, is God says, I'm calling you forgiven. You believe that? I'm calling you beloved son of God. If you don't believe you're loved by God, you will go to so many other places for comfort. You will run into so many other arms when you struggle with sin. But the challenge of belief is, do I believe what God says I am? Do I believe who God says I am? And that was the fight for Abraham. It wasn't about, did I cuss today or not? It's, do I believe who God says I am? And if I do, that's going to change the way I talk. It's going to change the way I act. But the fight of faith is, he called me this. I'm going to live like what he called me, not what other people call me, And I just think that's so challenging. God made him call himself father of many nations before he had a kid. That's tough.
Yeah, that's good. To your point, I was thinking about what Paul was saying to the church of Ephesus here in chapter 2, verse 8. It says, For by grace you have been saved through faith. That is not your own doing. It's a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. But this is what I was thinking about Abraham. For you are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. And so you think about, like, none of us are qualified to do this, but God qualifies us through the sanctification process. And just like Abraham's life, man, like, as he continued, like, and I think that's where we find our hope and confidence. And I think what Ben was saying about believing in something that may not be there, and we believe it, that God's going to come through. And I think when we realize our identity is in his workmanship and we are created for him, and the way we carry that out. And I think that's how Abraham got to where he was about to kill his son to that point. And I think that's the life of following Jesus. Is like, I know we talked about this last week, is, man, if, like Ben said, if 5 years from now, if our life and our testimony has not changed much, then maybe we haven't been dying to self, daily, and can, picking up our cross and following him. So I don't know. I thought that was spoke to me of, man, we're his workmanship, created in him, and I think that's Abraham started realizing that.
Yeah, that's good. I thought it was interesting too at the end when it says, no unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. And then you read in Hebrews 11, where it says, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. So I thought it's interesting in Romans 4, it's like Abraham did not waver in his faith because he believed what God had promised, but then Hebrews was like even Abraham wasn't, didn't fully see the promise that God had for him because something greater was in store. Paul walks, or the writer of Hebrews walks through Moses and so many other heroes of the faith. But I thought that kind of tie-in was interesting, that Abraham fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised, but then yet even Abraham didn't get to fully see what all he was promised.
Yeah, I think what you were touching on, Christian, too, like, okay, can people just sort of say, yeah, I believe whatever? Some of that's what Paul's fighting here of, again, for him in this Jewish context, people saying like, yeah, I got circumcised. I follow the law, whatever. And he's like, you are missing the story. Like, you're taking the law and doing with it things you're not meant to do. Humanity is so broken. God had to move, and God has been moving, and he pulled a pagan Abraham and made him right, not by works, but by faith. And he told him, I'm going to use you to bless the nations, not just one nation, all of them. God's plan was always to bring grace to the nations through Abraham, through the law. So don't miss this big narrative arc of the story. And what I love is Paul's just pulling us all into that, like, hey, the Bible's been written like this. There's only one main character to this story, and it's the God who's saving people. He's the hero of this story. And don't lose sight of that. And so even here, you got that, man, that, hey, Abraham had a role to play. But was Abraham going to be the one who takes you from the beginning of the movie to the end? No. He was a part of this part. And he'll be there at the end, but he's not going to walk this whole story through because he's not the main character. And we all have this role to play. All of us have this piece. We're invited to be on the team and be a part of it. And am I in? Am I in for God's story? Yeah, like Hebrews. I want to be counted among those people who played their part. And some of them, God's challenge is going to be Noah, build a boat while they're laughing at you. Some of them, it's going to be Abraham. Hey, try to have a kid when you're 100. I know the mechanics don't really work, but give it a shot and watch me show up. Like God's going to do all this craziness. For us, it's hold out the word of life in a culture that increasingly believes not only is it not true, but it's bad. So can we say, I'm going to take up my part and I'm going to trust that this book is true, the God who said it is true, and I'm walking with him? Then you may not live to see all that culminated. You just may not live to see the clouds break open. At some point, God taps us all on the shoulder and says, it's time for you to leave the party. But we'll all be there in the end together. And when we're there in the end, we're going to be glad we played a part in this big story,
Ben, maybe you can speak into this, but I feel like in that same realm of what we're talking about, like people can often just say they believe and there's no works. I feel like at some point we're gonna get to this in Romans, so might as well bring it up. But like, I definitely feel like I see often people get caught up in one attribute of God, like for example, his sovereignty, and so then it leads to this decision that like, well, he's in control. Or a phrase like that leads them to the decision that, well, there's nothing that I can do anyway, so I'm just gonna act however I want to. I'd be curious, like, what do you have anything to speak into that, and like, I don't know, on any front of that?
Yeah. I mean, one of Paul's, he's got two big goals in Romans. How is somebody right with God? And then how can we be right with each other? He's reconciling Jew and Gentile and humanity with God. And the humanity and God side, he's saying, you're not good with God by your works. It's by faith in him alone. Which the argument then breaks out, well, then can people just live lawless and people just live crazy? Like, are you advocating for people to do whatever, Paul? Like, he has to address that, And how do you address that? If you tell people you don't have to do anything to be right with God, well, then I can just live crazy. And so Paul is going to get there in about the midway point of Romans of saying, no. What God does is he sends his very spirit inside of you to change you from the inside out. That's what it is to be a believer, is the Spirit of God lands in you and he begins a work in you. right? And if that's not happening, you're not his. So work is a result of salvation, never a cause. And so it's funny because logic, and it's good to contemplate the sovereignty of God. Paul will do it in Romans 9 through 12.
In today's digital age, it's so easy to stumble upon harmful content that can really mess with your mind, your soul, and hurt those that you love. That's why I'm excited to share about Covenant Eyes. And Covenant Eyes is more than just an internet filter that is on your phone or your tablet or device or whatever it is. It's a tool that helps you stay accountable and pure while you're online. Many times you can search crazy things when you're online, and Covenant Eyes helps you to stay accountable, and it also helps with your purity. And it's a powerful software tool that monitors your internet activity, and it sends a report to a trusted friend or family member. And by doing this, it creates a support system that encourages healthy online habits. So imagine actually having peace of mind knowing that you are protected from harmful sites and having someone to talk to about your struggles. Covenant Eyes is not about restricting you, but it's about empowering you to live with integrity. I think sometimes having something like this, maybe you can feel like it's restricting you, but it's actually empowering you, like I said, to live in more freedom. You can walk in freedom, and Covenant Eyes help with people to do that by restricting things that they know that you should not be looking at. And it's so easy to install. It works on all of your devices, and it truly does make a difference. And like I said, you can take my word for it. I wrestled with pornography for years throughout late middle school, early high school, and even kind of early on into college. I really wrestled with, with this. It would be easy for me to see something and then, want to search something. And it wasn't until that I really, for me, got surrounded by a bunch of guys in college that all kind of wrestled with it, and we all started confessing it and finding freedom in it, that I really got freed from it. And so two of my best friends in college even had Covenant Eyes, 6 years ago when we were in college, and they had a past with really wrestling with pornography, and they took it past even having accountability as friends in our Bible study, but actually having Covenant Eyes on their phone. So do not just take my word for it, but you can join over 1.5 million people who have used Covenant Eyes to experience victory over porn. If you are looking to take control of your online life and honor God with your internet use, head over to covenanteyes.com/Huff to get your first month for free. Stay strong and walk in integrity online with our friends at Covenant Eyes.
This is a little crass, but Martin Luther said it, so it's his fault. He said, reason is a whore, meaning reason will jump in bed with anybody. And so it's funny how people will come up with reasons. Oh, so God's sovereign over all things, and so therefore God determines all things, so I determine nothing. Okay, I'm going to go get hammered on Friday. You're like,
Yeah.
Okay. You're going to use a theological argument to dismiss the clear commands of God in Scripture? Like, no. Yeah, you're using reason to jump in bed with some crazy thoughts. And somehow, and Paul will land it there in Romans 12, somehow God controls all things, and there's a mystery to it. And yet he tells us to act and will hold us accountable to our decisions. So Spurgeon wrestled with that. He's like, how do you reconcile divine sovereignty and human responsibility? He said they're like two parallel lines. God controls all things, but I make choices and am held accountable. How do those reconcile? He said those lines do intersect, just not this side of eternity. So he's like, hey, it's a mystery, man, but I believe him. And I believe him when he says I'm made right by faith. And I believe him when he says, hey, don't revel in the things Jesus came to destroy. So we walk away from sin. And if you don't engage that battle to walk away from that which crucified the King, then I don't know that you know him, because the Spirit of God hates it. He's going to fight against it. Does that make sense? I was just kind of rambling on, but does that?
No, yeah, that's so good.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's like putting into words the thoughts that I have, but I'm not able to articulate it that way.
Yeah, it's like I feel like it's talked about a lot, and it's a lot of people wrestle with it, and I know I have at different times, and I feel like probably not as clearly articulated as you just did. I feel like I just, at some point, if I try to wrap my head around his infinite nature, like I just have to submit at some point and be like, okay. And I say this to myself if I go down the train of thought. It's like the degree to which God's sovereignty is intertwined with my will and my decisions is unfathomable. Like, how could I possibly? I love music, and so the Benjamin Hastings has a song. It's like, to summarize, who could summarize infiniteness? To think I know only proves that I don't. And so it's just, at some point, I just feel like anytime I've gone down the train of thought, and I think it's not bad to, at least think about it, talk about it. But at some point, you're just gonna hit it.
Yeah.
You're just gonna hit a wall.
Yeah, I think of it like a cloud of mystery.
Yeah.
And you go, there are things beyond the veil you just can't see. And so some people go, oh, well. And you go, no. But there's revelation all the way up to it. There's so much we can learn about how God works. So just because you're going to hit mystery doesn't mean don't keep gaining knowledge. Keep going. And so I think you're right. You got to think about this kind of stuff. You got to think about who is God? How does he work? What does it mean for us? And yet every person's going to land where Paul does in Romans 12. He's like, hey, he's mysterious. His ways past finding out. It's crazy. You're going to be Jonathan Edwards. That was him. Contemplating the sovereignty of God almost made him nuts. And he went out and sat in a field and was looking at the flowers. And he ultimately got there. It's just like, and he's like, you know what? I just trust him, man. I'm trying to figure out how to run this world better. I think he sees more angles than I do. I'm just going to trust him. And that's what happened to me, man. I mean, when I was in my 20s, how to reconcile the sovereignty of God and human responsibility almost made me nuts. I was out in France going, Donna's like, isn't it beautiful out here? And I'm like, I'm about to lose my mind. Just struggling with how does all this work? And I studied the Bible. I mean, I've translated Romans from the original Greek to English. I did all that. And then at the end of the day, still had to sit down and go, like Abraham, but I trust you. I trust you. I trust you made a promise that I'm right with you because of what you did, and I trust you. So I'm walking with you. And that's the fight of faith. I'm going to keep believing in you. I'm going to keep believing what you say is best. And so faith is hard. It's not just a free pass to do whatever. It's the fight to believe what he says is true. So I commend your struggle, brother. I think it's good.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, I feel like when you get to that point where you, like in the field looking at the flowers, like how much peace comes with that. Like any moment that I start to wrestle with it, like when I do submit and I'm like, you know what, I don't know. And it's okay. And I just trust. Like even right now, like hearing your take on things, like I just feel this peace and I'm just like, I don't have to know. I don't have to understand fully, those things.
Well, how crazy making for Abraham. You're going to be a father, I promise. 10 years in, like, okay, how's that going? What's the deal? Another 10 years. Hey, man, just checking back in. Like, what are we doing here? And but God is going to make him wait, And he looks back and go, man, God was training me. He was training me into a man of faith. So that by the end, he said, hey, I believe God can raise the dead. I just trust him. And he had to burn that angst out of Abraham. But we all have it, that angst of, I want to hurry up and get there. He's like, all right, I'm going to have to burn that out.
That's so good. Yeah, so like in verse 11, when it says, he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. Is baptism is that like circumcision in a way, like when Jesus, and like that's like our outward response in a way, if that makes sense? Is there any correlation with circumcision from Abraham's day and Jesus and to baptism?
Yeah, I think you can certainly draw that line. I mean, Paul's argument here is circumcision was a sign of the covenant, right? That were part of the Mosaic covenant or the old covenant. And he's arguing Abraham was declared right with God before that ever came into existence. So obedience to the law does not make you right before God. And then he'll make the argument to them, actually, what the law did for us is revealed to us we were sinners. That was one of it has multiple purposes. That was one of it. But it was the sign that I'm entering into a covenant with God. And so it was an activity for a day to mark a certain relationship with God, as the nation of Israel was supposed to be the PR agents of God to a lost world. And now that the fulfillment of the promises come, we don't need to obey the Old Testament law, the Old Covenant in the same way. So he's letting them know that was always for a time, and now we're meant to be people by faith, because we were always meant to be people by faith. That's where this thing started. So he's trying to show them the law was important. It matters. The righteousness in the law matters. But ultimately, it's about faith in what God has done that transforms you from the inside out. But to your point, does baptism function in the similar way as circumcision? Yeah, I think so. I mean, in the sense that baptism is a symbol of saying, I'm in a covenant with him. I'm being knit together with the Trinity because of what Jesus did.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's good.
I think it functions that way for us as we think about entering the new covenant by faith.
So when Paul is talking here to the Jews, like, did it serve the purpose for what, like, did they believe what he was talking about? Because I know Jewish people now who don't believe that. So where over the course of, I guess, the last 2,000 years did, like, Jews result back to specifically the Torah and, like, not the New Testament? Because, like you said, Paul is trying to create this argument here for Jewish people with Abraham and Gentiles. And, I'm sure when Paul wrote it, I'm sure people believed it, but where's that disconnect gone from then to now of where people, of like Jewish people specifically, don't believe in kind of that idea of, whether there's the righteousness part through believing in Jesus, but yet it is based on following the law, but to where Paul says it's null and void. So how do you, where's the intersection point there of Paul's teaching, to where maybe they believed it then, but Jewish people don't believe that now?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You look at Paul's life. He was a Pharisee, highly educated Jew. And Jesus says, I'm the Messiah, the one you've been waiting for. I've come. Paul didn't believe it. A lot of them didn't believe it. Paul had to be knocked over by God. That's how God works, right? And then he understood, oh, here's how Jesus is the fulfillment. I missed it, apart from divine grace. So then he starts telling everybody, our Messiah's here. And he's going to synagogues, and some people, everywhere he goes, if you read the book of Acts, some people believe and some people want to kill him. And so he's like, this is a divisive thing. It's actually kind of wild, Christian. What the first extra biblical reference to Jesus is from Rome. It's two Roman officials writing to each other. And one of them's like, there was some big debate breaking out among the Jews in Rome about a guy named Chrestus. So I don't know. There's all this controversy among the Jews around this guy, Chrestus. So I just kicked all the Jews out of Rome, which he did. And in the book of Acts, it talks about that there was this tension in Jewish communities. Is Jesus the Messiah or not? And some believed he was, some didn't. And you see that everywhere Paul goes, he would go to the synagogue in town first, and some Jews would believe, some would want to kill him. And then he would go first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, and tell them all, hey, this guy isn't just the Messiah to the Jews. This is the God over all things who was always trying to use the Jews to get the gospel to all people. And so you look at the book of Acts, and Paul's constantly going Jew and Gentile, trying to bring them both together. By the time he gets to Rome, there was already believing communities. Jews that had been kicked out, like Priscilla and Aquila. And now, presumably in the book of Romans, some of them are coming back. So you got these Gentile churches now and Jewish churches. And rather than saying, y'all just do whatever, he's like, no, y'all are meant to get along. He reconciled you both together. And so a big part of the book of Romans is telling Jews and Gentiles, hey, you've been made into one family, grafted into one tree. Let's get along. But yeah, anywhere the gospel's preached, there's going to be people who believe it and come to faith. And there's going to be some that don't. And Paul has to wrestle with that in Romans 9 through 12 of what do we do with all these Jewish people who aren't believing? Their Messiah's here. And his argument in 9 through 12 is, hey, they refused the Messiah and it forced us out to the Gentiles, which you see in the book of Acts. And all these Gentiles are believing. And then Paul says, and I believe there's going to be a powerful move among the Jewish people where they come to the Messiah and we're all grafted into one tree. And Paul was saying that because that's what he was seeing happen. He was seeing some Jews believe, but not a lot. A lot of Gentiles are believing. They're all knit together. And I believe God's going to save even more as time goes by. And I trust him. So I do think you're right. There are Jewish people coming to faith in Jesus. I know several. And yet there are some that don't believe. But there seems to be an optimism in Paul in Romans 9 through 12 that no, but a great ingathering is coming of people who say, no, that is our King. That is the Messiah. And we trust him.
I have a thought on this that Ben, you said earlier, and I'd never thought about this, about Abraham being an idol worshiper when God spoke to him and called him in. And that struck me because I thought, okay, if you're a Jew or a Christian early on reading Romans, Paul's writing to you, you're in Rome, you followed the law. Paul is saying following the law is not the path to God, the path to righteousness. God is the path to God. God is the path to righteousness. He gives that to you, and not just to you as the Christian, the Jew, the circumcised, but also to the idol worshippers you're looking at in Rome. Like, it's not just for you, it's for them. And for me, who, when I read the prodigal son, falls more into the older brother category of being the judgmental type of like, I've done the right things. He is now thinks he can come in and get all the stuff. Where God's saying, no, it's actually for them as well. God is speaking to the idol worshippers. Those who are not in line with God right now, God is working for them. This is all for them as well as for you, as the older brother.
No, you're absolutely right that's what he's doing here. And that's what's so powerful. I mean, look back at verse 5. He made that argument. How did Abraham get justified? He believed in God, and it was counted as righteousness. And then in verse 5, and to one who does not work but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteous. So what did he just call Abraham in verse 5?
The ungodly.
The ungodly. He just called the original Jew the ungodly. He was like, that's how everyone got in.
Yep.
So if you're like, well, no, I'm part of this tribe and my people do it this way. And then he's like, no, we got in while we were ungodly. And so when God starts saving ungodly people, that's who he saves. That's how this works. And so it does kind of, part of what's happening here is he's humbling the people who want to feel justified by the fact that they were part of the right tribe or something. So, or obeyed or went to church their whole life or whatever. He's like, man, that was never the entry fee. The entry fee was acknowledging you're ungodly and God saves. So there's this beautiful humility being pushed into all this. Invitation and humility at the same time, But we all do this. I remember sitting with this lady that in an old folks home, and she was Methodist, and she was like railing on all these non-Methodists and talking about this Baptist lady keeps trying to be my friend, and these Baptists don't know what they're doing in this. And I remember sitting with this old lady and just going like, I don't even understand where this is coming from. And so then I looked at this photo album with her, and it's like, who are these people? And she started talking about all these people, that they were so lovely and kind and gracious. And she starts naming all these attributes. And I said, when I think of those attributes of being gracious and kind, I attach it to the word Christian, not the word Methodist. I was like, but it makes sense that was the tribe you were in when you experienced all this. And I was like, can I tell you something crazy? I'm not a Methodist. And you could see on her face, like, oh my God, I'm with one of the ungodly ones. But by this point, it was too late. Like, she liked me already. And you're like, uh-oh. So I was like, yeah, we all tend to do that. I'm not just banging on Methodists. We all tend to look at our tribe and go, we got this right. Mm-hmm. And you go, careful with making your righteousness based on what you've done. And it's about what God has done. And so there is a belief system that's the standard to get in. Do I believe the God who sent his son to rescue? Yeah, that's it. But then it's not about works. There's no boasting. And it was fun to watch me and this lady go, hey, we're not standing on Methodism, Baptist, etc. We're standing on Jesus and what he's done for us while we were ungodly. That's what we all stand on.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here in a second, but I thought it was cool how he closes out Romans 4, 23 through 25. He says, but the words, it was counted to him, were not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be counted to us who believe in him, who raised up Jesus who raised up from the dead Jesus our Lord, who was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. And I was reading that word delivered up, especially the Greek word translated, was used of casting people into prison or delivering them to justice. So I just think it's so cool how Paul closes out Romans 4 with, all these things about Abraham. He's like, it's also for you. It wasn't just, he said it for Abraham so that it can be true for you too. And I love how he ties it, back into the gospel, talking about how God raised Jesus from the dead, and that's who we are to put our faith in. It's not Abraham that we put our faith in, but it's in Jesus Christ. So I thought that was cool how he says, it was not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. I love how he kind of concludes the chapter with that, and then obviously ties it all into believing in Jesus.
Well, and I love, just if I could say this too, Christian, I love that you're leading this time and inviting guys into it. At some point, you got to jump in and you go, hey, sometimes the language can be hard to understand, but this is not beyond our understanding. And reading the book of Romans, it is climbing a high mountain, but there is a lot here to be gained, like Abraham, to strengthen our faith in who God is and what he's done. And so I love that you guys are doing this, man. I think it's awesome.
Man, well, I'm grateful for you, and I appreciate you you hopping in, because I definitely learned so much from you than I did any kind of commentary before this, and I really appreciate you hopping on and helping us provide some insight and context into kind of what we're looking at here. But that was awesome. I know that people are going to be challenged with that and encouraged to just to dig deeper into it. So thank you for joining us, man. That was great. That was powerful. Well, thank you for listening. Stay tuned for next week as we dive into Romans 5, where we're going to be talking about peace with God through faith. As we've said, faith is it's a huge thing throughout this book, and we're going to look at what that means to have peace with God through our faith. So stay tuned for next week as we dive into Romans 5, and I hope that today encouraged you and challenged you, and hope that you dive into Romans, that you like Ben said, it is like climbing the mountain, but there's so much that you can learn on that climb. So it might be intimidating because it is a deep book, and there's a lot of words that maybe we don't understand, but I just encourage you to just to take that leap and ask God that he would speak to you as you open his word, because there's nothing too complex for us to understand if we have the Spirit. So I thank y'all for listening, and hope that you enjoyed the episode.